The year was 1942, and the German war machine still roared across Europe. From the beaches of France to the burning sands of North Africa, the world trembled at the sight of the Iron Cross. Hitler stood at the height of his power, adored by millions, feared by nations, and surrounded by generals who saluted him with devotion. The propaganda promised victory without end. The German people believed it. Even the soldiers did. But deep inside the halls of command, behind closed doors filled with smoke and maps, a quiet unease began to spread. Something was changing, something the newspapers refused to print. At first, it was just whispers. Reports that didn't make sense. Divisions that never returned. Trains filled with wounded men rolling back from the front, silent and broken. Officers looked at one another and said nothing, but the truth was plain. The war was beginning to slip away. In the East, Hitler had promised triumph. He sent his finest, 500,000 men, to conquer the Soviet city of Stalingrad. It was supposed to be a quick victory, another shining name for the glory of the Reich. But it became a nightmare. Through the long winter of 1942, the frozen ruins of Stalingrad became a graveyard. Snow fell over the corpses of entire armies. German soldiers starved in cellars, burned furniture to stay alive, and fought rats for crumbs of bread. Commanders radioed Berlin, begging for supplies that never came. Hitler refused to retreat. Not one step back, he ordered. And so, hundreds of thousands of his men died following a command that made no sense. Inside the high command, generals began to doubt, not the war itself, but the man leading it. Some spoke carefully, using code words when they discussed the front. They called it a difficult situation. Others stopped writing letters home. They knew even their mail was being watched. When the last survivors of Stalingrad surrendered in early 1943, an icy silence spread across Germany. It was the first major defeat of the Third Reich. For the first time, Hitler's generals saw something they had never seen before: fear in his eyes. The Führer raged against his officers. He accused them of weakness, betrayal, and cowardice. He replaced experienced commanders with loyal followers who said only what he wanted to hear. The war was no longer led by strategy. It was led by delusion. In the smoky corners of Berlin's headquarters, men like Heinz Guderian, Erich von Manstein, and Albert Kesselring looked at each other and wondered how long they could keep obeying. They were soldiers, sworn to serve, but they also saw the truth written in blood across the eastern plains: Germany could no longer win. But to admit that, even to whisper it, was treason. Still, the cracks were growing. Reports came in from the Air Force. Allied bombers were reaching deeper into Germany. Cities like Cologne and Hamburg burned for days. Civilians huddled in basements, while the sky turned red. And yet, Hitler still promised final victory. The generals saw the widening gap between the speeches and the reality. They watched as Hitler's once calculated decisions turned into blind rage. He ordered divisions to hold impossible positions, calling any retreat cowardice. Thousands of men were sacrificed for ground that meant nothing. One officer later wrote in his diary, "We were no longer fighting to win. We were fighting to delay the inevitable." Meetings in Berlin became colder, tenser. The generals still stood at attention, still clicked their heels, still said, "Heil Hitler!" But their eyes no longer showed belief, only exhaustion. They began to realize something dangerous. They were following a man who could not see the truth. Outside, the German people were beginning to sense it too. Mothers received telegrams that their sons were missing. Trains brought home the wounded, men without limbs, eyes, or hope. The laughter and songs of victory faded from the streets. Yet in public, everything stayed the same. The regime demanded smiles, parades, and faith. No one could speak the truth. Even a whisper could mean the Gestapo's knock at midnight. So the generals whispered only to each other. Quiet words in hallways. Questions no one dared answer. What if the Führer was wrong? What if the war could not be won? What if Germany needed to surrender, not tomorrow, but soon, before everything was destroyed? They had seen the same pattern in history: great powers falling not because of weakness, but because their leaders refused to face reality. They felt it coming now, creeping through every report, every casualty list, every battle lost to the snow and the endless Russian steppe. One by one, the old confidence drained from the high command. The war rooms that once buzzed with strategy now carried only silence. The maps that once promised victory now marked the path of retreat. And in that silence, beneath the medals, the loyalty oaths, and the fear, began the first whispers of surrender. The men who had once sworn to conquer the world were now quietly wondering how to survive it. They did not yet know how far the fall would go, the bombings, the betrayals, the assassinations still to come. But by the end of 1943, they knew one truth that no order could erase. Germany's dream of victory had died in the snow at Stalingrad. And deep within their guarded hearts, the generals who had built an empire of war began to feel something they had never known before: doubt. The year 1943 turned into 1944, and the war that once seemed unstoppable was now slipping through Germany's fingers. The glory that had once surrounded Hitler began to fade. The men who had built his empire, the marshals, the field commanders, the generals who had followed him through every campaign, now found themselves trapped in a cage of their own making. They had sworn an oath of personal loyalty to Adolf Hitler. Not to Germany, not to its people, not even to the army, but to him. That oath was sacred, absolute, and unbreakable. To disobey was treason. To question him was death. Yet, as the losses grew, that oath began to feel less like honor and more like a noose. Inside the command posts, behind the heavy oak doors and the thick walls of the Führer's headquarters, tempers were beginning to crack. Generals who had once shouted, "Heil Hitler!" with pride now did so out of fear. They watched the man they had once believed in transform into someone they no longer recognized, paranoid, violent, and deaf to reason. Every meeting with him became a test of survival. He demanded loyalty, not truth. He wanted miracles, not facts. And when his generals could not deliver them, he humiliated them, sometimes in front of their peers, sometimes in front of his secret police. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, once the shining hero of North Africa, began to see the truth most clearly. He had watched his soldiers die in deserts that could not be conquered, and now he watched his homeland being devoured by bombs. Rommel still believed in Germany, but not in Hitler's madness. He spoke carefully, choosing his words as if each one could be his last. "A commander's duty," he said once, "is to save his men, not sacrifice them for a fantasy." Those were dangerous words in 1944. In another corner of the Reich, General Heinz Guderian, the architect of Germany's armored warfare, tried to reason with the Führer. He argued that they needed to regroup, to prepare defensive lines, to face reality. But Hitler did not want to hear about defense. He wanted attacks, always attacks. He pounded his fists on maps and screamed about final victories that existed only in his imagination. For the generals, every meeting became a nightmare. They were trapped between loyalty and logic, between survival and betrayal. They could see the war was lost, but to speak it aloud was to invite death. Some of them still believed, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of habit. They told themselves that if they obeyed long enough, somehow, something would turn the tide. But others began to whisper about darker options. By 1944, the word surrender had become poison, but the word resistance began to circulate in secret. The military elite, the men who had built the empire, now divided themselves into two kinds of officers. The first were the loyalists, those who still followed Hitler without question, believing obedience was duty even in ruin. The second were the realists, those who had begun to believe that obedience was now betrayal. They met in quiet homes, in offices after hours, speaking in low tones. Some of these men were no ordinary soldiers. They were respected, decorated, trusted. Yet inside their hearts, they carried the weight of treason. They asked themselves the question no soldier ever wants to ask: what if the greatest act of loyalty is to defy the man we once served? Meanwhile, on the front lines, the ordinary soldiers began to notice the same confusion. Orders contradicted each other. Units were sent to fight without supplies. Entire divisions vanished, not in battle, but in chaos. Hitler's dreams of control were collapsing under their own weight. The generals tried to hold things together, but even their voices were beginning to shake. They could no longer hide what they saw every day. Germany was bleeding to death. The air raids grew heavier. The nights were filled with fire. Children slept in bunkers. Cities that had once stood proud were now piles of smoking stone. Yet still, Hitler spoke of victory or death. For many generals, that phrase became literal. They began to understand that survival meant more than just living, it meant preserving what little honor remained in the ruins. Some began to think about what would happen after Hitler, if there even was an after. Would the Allies treat them as monsters? Could they somehow negotiate? Could they save what was left of their homeland? Others, like Rommel, began to believe that only one act could save Germany from total destruction, removing Hitler himself. But that thought was as dangerous as touching fire. The Gestapo's eyes were everywhere. Officers disappeared without warning. Even a misplaced word could end in execution. And so, the conflict inside the German high command turned inward. They fought not against the Allies, but against their own fear. Every handshake, every glance, every silence carried suspicion. No one knew who to trust. Still, in the corners of their hearts, some dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, if Hitler could be stopped, Germany could still be saved from complete ruin. That hope would soon take shape, not in a plan for surrender, but in a plot for assassination. By the spring of 1944, a small group of officers began to plan what many of them considered their final duty. Men like Claus von Stauffenberg, wounded but unbroken, believed that if they could kill Hitler, they could negotiate peace, end the bloodshed, and save millions. For others, it was not about saving Germany anymore. It was about saving their souls. They had sworn loyalty, yes, but not to madness. And as the war grew darker, as the skies filled with smoke and the earth trembled under the weight of bombs, the generals faced a choice that would define their legacy. To obey, and die with the Reich. Or defy, and die trying to save it. The whispers of surrender were no longer only whispers of defeat. They had become whispers of rebellion. By the time 1944 arrived, the world had already changed. The German army, once feared across continents, was now fighting on two fronts, losing on both. The Allies had landed in Italy. The Soviets were marching west. And in the skies above Germany, day after day, the thunder of Allied bombers shook the earth itself. Inside the walls of Hitler's headquarters, the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, the air was thick with paranoia. Maps covered every wall, red pins marking the front lines that were shrinking by the week. Reports came in constantly, each one worse than the last. Yet no one dared to speak the truth. Hitler's anger had become unpredictable, almost unhuman. He screamed at his generals, called them traitors, accused them of cowardice. His speeches were no longer about victory, but about vengeance. He ordered impossible defenses, sent armies into hopeless battles, and punished anyone who questioned him. To those around him, he no longer seemed like a man, but a force of destruction dragging the nation down with him. Among the officers, hope was dying, but desperation was not. Many believed that if Hitler remained in power, Germany would be completely destroyed. They had seen what was coming: the Allied invasion in the west, the Soviet advance from the east. The Reich was trapped in a tightening vice. And so, the whispers that had begun in secret meetings now took on a deadly purpose. A group of men, high-ranking officers, diplomats, and statesmen, began to meet quietly under the shadow of death. Their plan was simple but terrifying: to kill Adolf Hitler. One of them was Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg. A decorated officer, he had been wounded in North Africa, losing an eye, a hand, and 2 fingers, but not his will. He believed in Germany, but not in what Hitler had turned it into. Stauffenberg saw no future left but one: remove the Führer, end the madness, and surrender before Germany was annihilated. He joined a small circle of conspirators who called themselves the July Plot. Their mission: assassinate Hitler and seize control of the government through an emergency plan known as Operation Valkyrie, originally meant to stabilize the Reich in case of rebellion, now turned against its own leader. Every step of the plan carried the weight of death. If they succeeded, perhaps they could negotiate peace. If they failed, their families, their friends, and everyone they ever knew would be executed. Still, they prepared. On the morning of July 20th, 1944, Stauffenberg entered the Wolf's Lair carrying a briefcase. Inside was a small but powerful bomb. The meeting room was hot, crowded, filled with senior officers and aides. Hitler stood at the center, leaning over a large map of the Eastern Front. Stauffenberg placed the briefcase near the Führer's feet, close enough to kill him, then quietly excused himself. Minutes later, the bomb exploded. The blast tore through the wooden room, splintering the table and throwing men to the ground. Smoke filled the air. Cries echoed through the corridors. But fate intervened. A thick wooden table leg had deflected the force of the explosion, shielding Hitler just enough to save his life. When Stauffenberg heard the explosion from a distance, he believed Hitler was dead. He rushed back to Berlin to set Operation Valkyrie into motion. For a few short hours, it looked as though the plan might succeed. Units began taking control of key buildings, arresting SS officers, believing the Führer was gone. But then, word came from the Wolf's Lair. Hitler was alive. He appeared on radio, his voice trembling with rage but still commanding. "A small clique of traitors," he said, "has tried to stab me in the back. They will be crushed." And they were. Within hours, the Gestapo moved with brutal precision. The conspirators were arrested, beaten, tortured. Stauffenberg himself was executed that same night, shot by firing squad in the courtyard of the War Ministry. His last words: "Long live sacred Germany." In the days that followed, the purge spread like wildfire. More than 7,000 people were arrested. Over 4,000 were executed. The hangings were filmed on Hitler's orders, slow, humiliating deaths meant to send a message to every corner of the military: loyalty or death. Inside the High Command, the effect was devastating. The whispers that had once filled the corridors of power were now gone, replaced by fear so thick it could be felt in every breath. Generals who had doubted Hitler now fell silent forever. Even those who had never taken part in the plot were executed simply for knowing someone who did. The Wehrmacht, once proud and independent, was now broken. Its commanders were no longer strategists. They were puppets. Hitler controlled every movement, every decision. He no longer trusted anyone but himself and a handful of fanatics. Still, the front lines collapsed. The Allies stormed into France after D-Day. The Red Army crushed the eastern defenses. The Reich was bleeding from all directions. But Hitler refused to see it. He spoke of new miracle weapons, of secret divisions that did not exist. He demanded attacks from troops that no longer had ammunition. He called every retreat a betrayal, every surrender a crime. Those who had once stood proudly beside him now watched with hollow eyes as he dragged the country deeper into ruin. Even his closest aides whispered of madness. And yet, the generals still saluted. They still obeyed. Some did it out of fear. Some out of habit. And a few, perhaps the most tragic of all, still did it out of hope, believing somehow that history would turn once more in their favor. But it never would. The failure of the July 20th plot marked more than the death of its conspirators. It marked the death of the last hope for peace from within. From that moment on, Hitler ruled through terror alone. His generals were not partners. They were prisoners. In the months that followed, Germany would descend into its final nightmare. The skies would burn, the cities would crumble, and the Reich would collapse beneath its own weight. But the story did not end there. Because even in the ruins, even as defeat became certain, a few surviving generals would begin to plan something else. Not rebellion this time. Not resistance. But survival. And as winter approached once more, the whispers of surrender would return, quiet, cautious, and desperate, echoing through the ashes of a dying empire. The winter of 1945 was like no other Germany had ever known. The once proud empire that had terrified Europe was now nothing but rubble and ashes. Cities that had glowed with banners and parades just a few years before were now silent wastelands, smoking ruins filled with hunger, fear, and ghosts. Snow fell on what was left of Berlin, not on marble and stone, but on cratered streets and burned-out tanks. In the east, the Red Army was closing in. In the west, the Americans and British were crossing the Rhine. The Reich was collapsing from both sides, and everyone knew it. Everyone, except one man. Deep beneath the ruined city, in a bunker 30 feet below the ground, Adolf Hitler still raged against the inevitable. His eyes sunken, his hands trembling, he pored over maps that no longer matched reality. Divisions he commanded on paper no longer existed. Generals who reported to him dared not tell the truth. He spoke of phantom armies, of new weapons that would turn the tide. He demanded counterattacks from troops that had no fuel, no ammunition, no hope. The man who once ruled the continent now ruled only shadows and delusions. Above him, the real world was disintegrating. Civilians dug trenches with their bare hands. Women carried buckets of water to douse fires started by Allied bombs. Children, barely teenagers, were given rifles and told to defend the fatherland. They called them the Volkssturm, the People's Army. But they were not soldiers. They were children fighting against tanks. German generals, once proud and decorated, now stared in horror as boys in school uniforms marched past them. Some tried to stop it. Others turned away, unable to watch. They had fought their whole lives for Germany. Now they were watching it die. One by one, they realized that the war was over. Not in days, not in weeks, it was already over. But to speak those words aloud was still dangerous. Hitler still ordered executions for defeatism. Men were hanged in the streets with signs that read, "I was too cowardly to fight." Inside the high command, silence ruled. Generals met in cold rooms, their uniforms spotless but their faces gray with fatigue. Every conversation began with a salute and ended with despair. General Heinz Guderian, one of the last remaining strategists with courage to speak truth, tried once more to convince Hitler to face reality. He begged for negotiations, for retreat, for anything to save lives. Hitler exploded in fury. He screamed about betrayal, about cowards, about vengeance. That was the last time Guderian ever tried to reason with him. As January turned to February, the German army was in full retreat. The Eastern Front had become a flood of refugees, soldiers and civilians moving westward, fleeing the Soviet advance. Villages were abandoned, roads packed with horse carts, wounded men limping through the snow. The Red Army showed no mercy. After years of Nazi atrocities, revenge had come home. Entire towns vanished beneath the firestorm of retribution. The generals who had once led invasions were now leading evacuations. For the first time in the war, the German officers no longer spoke of victory. They spoke only of time. How much longer can we hold? How many men do we have left? Can we surrender before the Russians reach Berlin? But even surrender was dangerous. If any officer tried to negotiate, he risked execution by his own side. And so, the whispers of surrender grew softer, careful, shared only in secret among trusted friends. In March, the Allies crossed the Rhine. By April, American tanks were rolling through the heart of Germany. Entire divisions surrendered without firing a shot. They were tired, starving, and done. Some generals began to contact the Allies through secret channels. They knew Hitler would never surrender, but perhaps they could. They hoped to save the western half of Germany from the Soviets, to surrender to the Americans, not the Russians. In the bunker, Hitler called it treason. He ordered the arrest of any commander who dared to retreat or negotiate. But his power was fading. His orders often never reached the front. His empire was crumbling faster than he could scream. As April deepened, Berlin became a vision of hell. Artillery shells rained day and night. The air was filled with the constant rumble of bombs. Civilians huddled in basements, praying for an end to the madness. The generals who remained in the city moved like ghosts, exhausted, hopeless, waiting for something they could not stop. On April 30, 1945, the whispers of surrender became reality. In his bunker, surrounded by the wreckage of his dream, Adolf Hitler took his own life. When word spread, the reactions among the generals were not of shock, but of silence. Some felt relief. Others felt only emptiness. The man they had served, the man they had feared, was gone. But the war did not end with his death. The machinery of the Reich still ground on for a few more days, running on inertia and denial. Orders still came from Berlin, though no one followed them. Generals in the field began surrendering on their own terms. Some negotiated with American officers, others simply laid down their weapons and waited. In the final days, a strange calm settled over the ruins of Germany. The thunder of guns faded, replaced by the soft sound of footsteps, soldiers walking into captivity. For the generals, it was not victory or defeat anymore. It was release. Some wept as they surrendered. Others stared blankly, their faces hardened by years of lies and death. The proud eagles on their caps now looked meaningless, symbols of an empire that had devoured itself. One Allied officer who accepted a German surrender later said, "They did not look beaten. They looked relieved." For years they had lived under orders, fear, and obedience. Now at last they were free, not in glory, but in ruin. The snow melted. The guns fell silent. The war in Europe was over. But in the ashes of that final winter, one truth remained unshakable. It had not been bombs or bullets alone that destroyed the Third Reich. It was pride, denial, and blind loyalty, the kind that silences reason until it's too late. And for the men who had once stood closest to power, that truth would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They had followed orders. They had obeyed to the end. And when the end came, it was their obedience, not their courage, that had brought them there. The war that had consumed the world was now down to its final, trembling breaths. In the rubble-strewn streets and smoking fields of Europe, the once mighty German army, the Wehrmacht, was dissolving into surrender. What had begun as whispers among the generals had now become reality. There was no glory left. No more talk of victory. Only silence, exhaustion, and the long shadow of consequence. In a small brick schoolhouse in Reims, France, on the night of May 7, 1945, the weight of history pressed down on the men inside. The walls still bore the scars of war, cracked plaster, smoke stains, the faint smell of gunpowder lingering in the air. At a wooden table, under harsh lamps, sat General Alfred Jodl, the chief of operations for what was left of the German High Command. His uniform was still neat, his posture still rigid, but his face told a different story, a face hollowed by defeat and disbelief. Across from him stood General Walter Bedell Smith, representing the Allied command, with Soviet and French officers beside him. The room was quiet except for the faint scratching of pens and the ticking of a clock. Jodl hesitated before signing. For years he had obeyed orders, followed the path laid out by his Führer, a path that led only here. Now, with his pen trembling, he realized the truth: the dream of the Reich had turned to dust. He looked at the paper before him, the act of unconditional surrender. Every word was final. Every line meant an end, not only to a war, but to an era. At 2:41 a.m. he signed. The war in Europe was over. News of the surrender spread like a quiet wave through the broken country. There were no celebrations in Germany. Only relief, a deep, aching relief that the killing had finally stopped. In Berlin, soldiers laid down their rifles and stared into the gray morning sky. Some wept. Some simply sat in silence. Others wandered aimlessly through the ruins, as if searching for something they could no longer name. For the generals, it was the moment they had long known would come, the moment they had feared, and yet, in their hearts, had wished for. Men like Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, who had once barked orders across Europe, now stood before Allied officers as prisoners. When he signed the final ratification of surrender in Berlin on May 8, his hands did not tremble. But his eyes, proud, sharp, and cold, held the emptiness of a man who had lost everything he believed in. He saluted the victors stiffly, turned, and walked away. Behind him, 1,000-year Reich had lasted only 12. The ordinary soldiers felt at first the stillness. No more air raids. No more orders. No more reason to fight. The guns that had thundered for 6 long years were silent. In the ruins of small towns, people came out from basements and shelters. They saw the sunlight for the first time in weeks. Mothers clutched their children. Old men fell to their knees in prayer. Across the land, the conquerors and the conquered stood face to face. American and British soldiers shared cigarettes with their former enemies. Soviet troops, hardened and scarred, stared in disbelief at the destruction. For a moment, just a moment, there was no hatred. Only the exhausted understanding of men who had survived what should never have been. Among the generals, some spoke of justice. Others spoke of survival. Many knew what awaited them: trials, shame, and history's unforgiving judgment. Yet, for a few brief hours after the surrender, they felt something unfamiliar: peace. Peace not as victory, but as release. The oaths, the orders, the lies, all of it had ended. The voice they had feared for so long, the man who had demanded blind obedience, was gone. Now, only silence remained. In that silence, some began to reflect. Too late, but finally. General Guderian once said, "There are no winners in a war like this. Only survivors and ghosts." And as the smoke cleared across Europe, that truth hung heavy in the air. The surrender did not erase what had been done. Millions were dead. Cities were gone. The world had changed forever. But in the hearts of the men who had once commanded armies, something deeper had shifted. They realized that wars are not truly lost on battlefields. They are lost the moment men stop questioning, stop thinking, stop feeling, the moment loyalty becomes blindness. For Germany's generals, that moment had come years before the war ended. Their defeat was written not in Reims or Berlin, but in the first whispers they ignored, in the first truths they buried beneath fear and pride. When they finally surrendered, it wasn't only their weapons they laid down. It was the illusion of righteousness, the lie that obedience could ever justify evil. And so, as May 1945 dawned, the world breathed again. The war was over, but the lessons had just begun. The whispers of surrender had become a voice, quiet, somber, eternal. A warning carried through time. That even the mightiest empires can fall. And the proudest generals can lose everything. When they mistake obedience for honor. When the guns fell silent and the smoke drifted away, a strange quiet settled over the world. The war that had once roared through every valley, every city, every soul, was over. But for those who survived, the silence was not peace. It was reflection. Germany lay in ruins, not only in buildings and bridges, but in spirit. The generals who had once stood tall now sat behind bars, staring at the weight of their choices. They had fought for power, for pride, for the illusion of destiny, and lost everything that truly mattered. Across the ocean, in America, families gathered around radios and newspapers, reading the words, "Victory in Europe." They cheered, they cried, they prayed in gratitude. Yet even then, the deeper truth echoed: freedom had triumphed, but at a terrible cost. History often paints wars in bold strokes of victory and defeat. But when we look closer, we see something more fragile: the human soul, tested and torn by ambition and obedience. The German generals were not born monsters. Many were soldiers raised in honor, duty, and love for their homeland. But somewhere along the way, honor became blind loyalty. And blind loyalty became complicity. That is the lesson history never stops whispering. When men stop questioning their leaders, when truth becomes dangerous to speak, when conscience is traded for obedience, nations begin to crumble, not from without, but from within. It's easy to look back and say, "I would have done differently." But history reminds us, even the strongest, even the proudest, can be deceived when fear and pride walk hand in hand. For America, for every free nation, that truth remains a warning and a call. To remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the strength to speak truth even when silence is safer. As the shadows of that terrible war fade into memory, the whispers of surrender still reach across time. They remind us that freedom, once won, must always be guarded, not just with weapons, but with conscience. Because the greatest battles are not fought on fields of war, but in the hearts of those who choose between obedience and truth. And so ends another chapter from the dark corridors of history, a story of pride, obedience, and the quiet cost of silence. The generals who once commanded legions learned too late that true strength isn't in following orders, it's in having the courage to question them. Here at Revolution Chronicles, we keep those echoes alive, so the lessons paid for in blood are never forgotten. If this story moved you, help us keep history's voice alive. Like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to join us on more journeys into the past that shaped who we are today. Until next time, remember, the past never truly fades. It only waits for us to listen.